Emma, I'm all set.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Really great to be here with you today. And thank you, Joy, for inviting us in. We're excited to talk about incorporated libraries, and we'll touch on some municipal library as well. And so just quick introduction to ourselves. My name is Emma Paradise. I'm the manager of policy and strategic initiatives here on the Common Good Vermont team. So I spent a lot of time at the State House, as well as getting to know the nonprofits in our network, exploring policy issues, sharing information, and really just working to support our sector from that perspective. Martin, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm Martin Hahn. I'm the director of Common Good. I've been there just about a year. Previously, I was the director of the Vermont Coalition on Homelessness, what is now Downstreet Housing and Community Development. And I also had the good fortune to be the executive director of the Kellogg Hubbard Library for a few years. Almost 20 years ago, working alongside Hillary Farrington, who was the library director, and I really focused on fundraising, endowment, building issues. So I have a little bit of insight into library work. And just a quick introduction to this morning. So we got an hour and a half that we're going to be together. To state the, I'll state the obvious, perhaps, that Emma and I are not attorneys nor CPAs, but we're going to be talking about legal and accounting issues. But if you have any confusion or uncertainty, either as a staff or a board member, urge you to consult legal or financial advisors. We're going to be sharing our screen for most of the morning. We are going to come out maybe halfway to go off screen for questions and discussion. So feel free to keep video off, but when we come back together, it'd be great to the extent that you're able to go to turn your video on for a couple of minutes as we engage in the content. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can raise your hand virtually, put a question into the chat, or just feel free to speak up. And Joy is going to help us manage the room. We will share these slides, or have shared these slides with Joy, and they'll be available to you. So you'll see as we go through, there's some fair amount of hyperlinks, so you'll have access to the document and can go deeper on any subject you'd like to. Next slide, Emma.
So just a brief introduction to Common Good Vermont. We've worked with a lot of you, but not everyone in the room. So Common Good Vermont is the only statewide program dedicated to uniting, strengthening, and advocating for Vermont's nonprofit sector. We are the go-to resource for nonprofits to share resources, gain skills, and build partnerships. We're also a statewide program of United Way of Northwest Vermont. And we recently became a membership program as well. So we welcome you to join us. And this is just an overview of the services that we offer. So everything from sector advocacy and issue convening, which is sort of my bread and butter. We're at the State House. We're sharing information about policy and regulatory issues. We host convenings like the Nonprofit Summit we just held. We issue sector reports like the Nonprofit Wages and Benefits Report. We also run 3 different certificate cohort programs, one in nonprofit management, one in fundraising and development, and one in training and consulting. We also offer technical assistance and training like we're doing today. We also have an event calendar with webinars and on-demand learning opportunities as well. And then finally, we have our website and online resources. We have a weekly nonprofit newsletter. Definitely encourage you to sign that up. Everything from funding to job postings to relevant and current sector information you can find in there, as well as on our news blog. Our events calendar has a bunch of trainings for the sector. And then we also have a job posting board and a board government position board. So those are other resources available to you. And this is just an overview of Vermont's nonprofit sector. So there's over 6,400 Vermont nonprofits serving all corners of our state, generating more than $10 billion in revenue annually. And as recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows, 1 in 5 Vermont workers is employed by a nonprofit. Up until recently, that number was 1 in 7. So our sector is growing. And then also nonprofits contribute 5.7 billion per year to the economy through wages, paid retail and wholesale purchases, which is nobody mind.
There you are. Okay. So what is a nonprofit organization? So nonprofits are organizations that serve a public or mutual benefit, and those are two different things. So public is, I think, what we often think about when we think about a charitable or nonprofit organization: libraries, social services, youth services, arts, health, education. In this day and age, we hear a lot about responding to substance use disorder and homeless response. So those are what we think of as a public benefit. A mutual benefit is nonprofits like a chamber of commerce, fraternities, homeowner associations, professional or trade associations. So what we're going to be focusing on this morning are public benefit organizations. And primarily, we're going to be talking about organizations that are considered 501c3 organizations by the IRS. Next slide, please, Emma. So there are about 6,400 nonprofits in the state, and it was an impressive number that Emma just reported on, that 1 in 5 employee people in Vermont work for a nonprofit organization. And one of the things I want to call out about that includes University of Vermont, which is a nonprofit organization, the UVM Medical Center, most of the hospitals in the state are 501c3. So the scale of the organizations go from maybe 0 employees that's just run by volunteers to significant established organizations in the state. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. So Common Good Vermont is, we have 3 staff and 1 business. So we're sort of the norm in some ways. So when we then look at all Vermont nonprofits, we can break it up into different types of nonprofits. Let's start with the other 501cs. Let me go to my notes. So that includes, I'd say, probably most significantly, 501c4s. A C4 is a nonprofit that also does a significant part of its work is related to lobbying and other political activities. A C5 is labor, agriculture, and horticultural organizations, and a C6 are business leagues, real estate boards, things like that. And then we move into the 501c3s. There are 2 types of C3s. There are public charities and private foundations. What distinguishes, I mean, other than the obvious, is that a public charity receives most of its financial support from the public and private sector to further its charitable activities, as opposed to a foundation. Can be controlled by the members of a family or a small group of individuals, and its support comes from a more limited sector. So all nonprofits, then 501c other, then 501c3s, and then in the C3s, there are public charities and private foundations. And next slide, please, Emma.
Thanks, Martin. So just to break it down a bit more, it could be a little confusing what a nonprofit by definition is according to the state versus the federal level. So essentially in Vermont, or maybe I'll start with the federal. So the federal recognition of nonprofits essentially is a tax status. So you're a nonprofit if you file your 1023 with the IRS and you receive confirmation that you are a 501c3 and you are tax exempt. At the state level, in Vermont, you can incorporate a nonprofit by filing with the Secretary of State and complying with Statute Title 11B, which is something we'll dive into a bit more later. And this is the first step in forming a nonprofit if your goal is to achieve tax exempt status. But it does not alone confer tax exempt status. Alternatively, in some cases, small grassroots groups might opt to operate under an assumed business name as an unincorporated nonprofit association, or rather an association of individuals. And this is solely for the purpose of name recognition if their goal isn't to achieve tax exempt status. And then once incorporated, a nonprofit can choose to apply for tax exempt status with the IRS. And for most nonprofits to qualify for tax exemption in Vermont, you also need that federal tax exempt status as well.
Emma, there's already a question in the chat.
Oh,
What
great.
would a covered bridge? Sorry, what would a covered bridge society nonprofit? What area would that fall under?
So a covered bridge society nonprofit, I believe if you're incorporated with the state of Vermont, that would make you a nonprofit corporation. And if you have 501(c)(3) status at the federal level, then you would be a 501(c)(3) organization and be tax exempt. Is that, sorry, I can't quite see the ads, but if there's more
Jean, does that answer your question? Yeah, she says thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joy. Appreciate that. When we get into libraries, it does get a little more complicated. So there are different types of libraries. There's incorporated libraries, which I think is the category many of you fall into today. And these are libraries that were formed through incorporation. You're a private nonprofit, and you're governed by a board of directors, which could also be referred to as a board of trustees per Vermont statute. Those two terms can be used interchangeably for nonprofits. You may be a municipal library, and municipal libraries are libraries formed by a town vote rather than through incorporation. And these are governed by a board of trustees that typically are made up with appointments from local governments and representing the communities they serve. And then there's a third branch, the Friends of the Library. These are incorporated nonprofits with 501(c)(3) status that are in support of usually a municipal, but it could be an incorporated library. And these are independent from the library and its board. And I think one caveat that sort of goes contrary to what I said in the last slide is that all public libraries are tax exempt in Vermont. Vermont Title 22 that speaks to public libraries states that when the instrument providing the endowment declares that the institution shall be a free public library, such library and other property from the corporation shall forever be exempt from taxation. So while all libraries are tax exempt, many do want to apply for tax exempt status as there may be certain grants that don't give to government entities, or their donors may want to have that tax exempt status.
Emma, I have a question. This is Joy.
Yeah.
So a municipal library in and of itself is tax exempt, or is it tax exempt through the town?
It is
Like, is
tax exempt through the town, but my understanding is that an incorporated library is also tax exempt. And from the tax official perspective, it is treated as a government entity.
So for a municipal library, can they operate as a tax exempt on their own, or do they, like if they're applying for a grant, or if they are
They can, but some
purchasing
grants
something?
might say only nonprofits, not government entities, are eligible for this funding. If that makes sense.
Okay, but yeah, but I'm trying to figure out, like, would the library have to go through the towns, like use the tax exempt number of the town, or should they also have their own? Or could they also have their own?
I believe that you can request a letter from the IRS that confirms your tax exempt status through the municipality.
Okay. All right.
So that's associated with your EIN.
Okay, great. That's what I thought, but I thought maybe you were saying something different. But thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
And there is a question in the chat as well. That's a question. Never mind. You covered it. Thanks.
Okay.
It was basically the same thing I was asking.
Yeah, just to clarify, I want to be, this is muddy area. A municipal library is exempt from taxes, but it is not a 501(c)(3) according to the IRS. That is a donation to the library. Even though it is a nonprofit and is exempt, is not deductible from somebody's income as a charitable gift. Am I getting that right, Emma?
I believe so.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So with that, information. We're curious, and you can drop this in the chat. Which of these statuses applies to you? Are you an incorporated nonprofit library, a municipal library? Do you have a Friends of 501c3? Are you a library district, or are you unsure about what your status is? Incorporated nonprofit.
Hybrid. Vicky, I wonder if you might come off mute and tell us about your library.
Yeah, so I'm very new to it, but it's my understanding that it was not incorporated by town vote years ago, as far as I understand. And it also is not a fully incorporated 501c3, i.e., I believe the process was started but not completed. However, it operates as both. So, for example, the town owns the library building and provides insurance and liability insurance, et cetera. Employees we have a board of trustees, of which I'm on, and the library staff is not subject to, the payroll systems and protections of town employees. So, yeah, it's not a great position to be in. And I think the library has been sort of coming to terms with that over the last year. There's been a change in directorship, and that new person has identified this issue and really kind of been trying to work on it. And my background is I've run a lot of larger nonprofits and used to be a practicing lawyer. So I kind of agree with her assessment in terms of liability issues and et cetera. So we are not in a good place, I think, liability wise or risk management wise, and need to tackle this. So yeah, it's weird.
That is weird. So say again, who does the staff, who employs the staff?
I'll turn my camera on because it's kind of weird talking in a black box. So the library employs a staff. Yeah. So the director
it's not incorporated.
Correct. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I see there are a couple of you in the room, and I wonder, Joy, whether we might have a discussion at a later day, just get everybody in the room to talk this through, because this does strike me as particularly for supporters of the library would add some confusion.
Yes, so they're correct. So yeah, if anybody makes a donation now, technically, like they do solicit donations to come to the library, so they don't go to the town. And they talked about creating a Friends of Library, but yeah, so we actually have the council for the town coming to our next board meeting and is going to talk about it. And then hopefully, if we get any direction, I'm happy to provide it to others on here who are in. I'll stick my email in the chat in case anybody wants to reach out later, and I'll let you know where we are on it.
Great, thank you, Vicki. Really interesting situation. So,
Vicki, did you already say what library you're from?
Oh, I didn't. Sorry, Lawrence Memorial in Bristol.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question in the chat about is there a directory of libraries that indicates which are municipal? Joy, is such a document?
Yes, so I
exist?
answered that in the chat. We have it in the annual report that libraries send in, but not every library sends it in. And then also it's based on self-reporting. So
okay,
we have a pretty good idea, but it might not be 100%.
Got it. Thank you.
By our assessment, it's about a third of the libraries total are incorporated. But there are these, as we were just talking about, the hybrid or the ones that aren't quite sure or that seem to be a mix, and it's the whole thing where the town might own the building, but it's an incorporated library. That certainly exists too. So it does definitely get complicated.
Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. I think we're ready to go to slide 11, Emma, and then we'll be going off screen in a minute as well.
Okay.
So there are two categories of regulations that over the or oversight of the incorporated libraries. You have state and federal. And on the state side, it's Vermont Nonprofit Statute Title 11B. And my advice on this is simple, which is encourage you to read it. It's surprisingly straightforward language and provide some really interesting information. So Emma, I'm going to share screen if I might. Do you see my webpage? Great. So this is, I just clicked on the link that's in the slide, which we'll go back to and that you'll have, which takes you to Title 11B. And this is, I just sort of randomly picked. So this is Chapter 3, Purposes and Powers of a Nonprofit Corporation. And it's got a, there's a lot of things that are within the power of the nonprofit organization. You can purchase land, you can purchase buildings, you appoint directors. What I really like most about this is section paragraph 18, which is you can do all things necessary or convenient, not inconsistent with law, to further the activities and affairs of the corporation. You have broad latitude to per state law to achieve your mission. All right, I'm going to unshare. And then go back to slide 11, please. Great. So that's the Vermont Nonprofit Statute 11B. It's got filing requirements, incorporation and bylaws, membership, members, meeting and voting, etc. Under federal, the 501c3 is a reference to IRS statute. The link that's in here is actually not to the statute itself, but to various subheadings of what's important to know about a 501c when it comes to federal law. It defines charitable donations and how they get recognized, talk about your annual tax filings, which we're going to be spending some time on later, unrelated business income, and places restriction on political activities. I want to just touch base on unrelated business income. I actually had some trouble understanding how this might apply to a library. I think it's clear to me that a book sale is related income. If you have a bookmobile and you're going to sell the bookmobile and you get revenue from that, that's related income and is not business income. And when I went to search, I didn't find anything that was obvious. But one thing that occurred to me, I know when we were at Kelly Hubbard, we considered maybe putting in a coffee shop in the basement. Would the revenue from the coffee shop be unrelated business income? It's something that I would want to talk to a CPA. And I don't know if there's anybody in the room who whose library has unrelated business income. Are you doing something that's a little out of the norm? Let's see, go to the chat. Anne, could you say what, can you come off mute and say the energy investment credits? Can you say about what that is?
Yes. Yes. Part of the, I can't remember if there was the Infrastructure Investment Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, but part of that was the IRS can give nonprofits and towns credits for renewable energy investments. Even though they don't pay taxes, it's considered a tax credit. And so we are paid cash, in theory. It hasn't worked yet, but cash to finance part of those projects, up to 30%, depending on the type of project. And it's just the way IRS decided to handle it was through that unrelated business income tax form, which is 990T. There's been a whole slew of problems with filing that, and IRS has acknowledged it, so they're still working through it.
So interest in dividends and investments, I'm not sure that that would be taxable, particularly if the revenue is used to support the operation of the library. That is, if you have an endowment, for example, and it's generating revenue but the revenue is used for charitable purposes, I I question whether that in fact is taxable. Meredith, do you want to sort of say something more about this? Because this is important.
Yes, it would be unrelated taxable income, but it's not enough to jeopardize the 501c3 status of a library because, for example, in our little library, we have, maybe $1,000 worth of interest income on a CD. And yes, that it ultimately ends up being used in the library for library purposes. But I believe it would be considered unrelated taxable income when we're filing the return. I don't think it has much impact, but I believe that's how it works.
Well, interesting. And I apologize for not knowing this. And I think Emma and I will do some follow up on this after this session and send an email to Joy what we learn about this question, because I think that's important. I know that some of the libraries have, in fact, some significant revenues from an endowment, and so this is an important question.
I certainly could be wrong about that, but that's my understanding of how it works. So yeah, I'd love to have more clarity on it.
Great, thank you. Next slide,
Martin,
please,
just
Emma.
to speak to
Yeah.
Emma's question, she suggested that maybe space rentals for private non-entity, for private entity for non-public use. Typically, libraries don't charge for that. They either make them open to their meeting rooms open to nonprofits, or they don't. So I don't think that's probably happens maybe at all, or not very often anyway.
Yeah, or if there's a room fee, it's a fee that's directly related to the it's not revenue, it's offsetting their costs of offering that space,
Right.
janitorial services or something like that. Okay, next slide. So Title 11B, I'm not going to read this, just leave it up for a second. We've gone through it again. I just encourage you to read it.
And just so now for some high level, how to protect your tax exempt status. There's a lot here, but I think a lot of it's pretty intuitive. First, tax exempt organizations cannot be organized or operate for private interests. They cannot devote a substantial part of activities to lobbying. And if we have time, we'll talk a bit more about this later. They must remain nonpartisan, have no illegal activities, keep up with filing and reporting requirements, which we'll get into in a minute here, maintaining proper records, create and adhere to strong governance policies, and comply with disclosure requirements. And you can find more information about all of these requirements in the IRS compliance guide, which is also hyperlinked here. Thank you. I see Anne has dropped in the chat. From the IRS. Thanks, Anne.
Great, thank you, Anne. We'll spend some time on that after we get out of this session. Really interesting topic. So nonprofit filings and reports. The first one, the biennial report, I've made a note to myself that this is easy peasy. This is an online report of which you're going to update who's the registered agent. So the registered agent often is an attorney, but it doesn't need to be. It could be the library director is the registered agent, or the mailing address is probably not going to be changing for the library. And so the state pays attention to this, however. It needs to be done. You'll get a reminder. And if you don't do it, then the state will identify you as inactive, which may impact how particularly foundation might recognize you. So it's not hard and it needs to be done. We're going to spend some time later in this session talking about unemployment insurance. And then on the federal, the 990, we're going to talk about that, I believe, on the next slide, maybe. We've talked about unrelated business income, and there is a special 990 form for that, to report that. I don't believe anybody in the room would be subject to federal employment taxes and unemployment insurance taxes. Next slide, please, Emma. So Form 990, I'm going to add the caveat again that we're not financial experts, but I've been engaged with 990s for a good part of my work life. There are different types of Form 990s, under $50,000 or average less than $50,000 for 3 years. It's probably not going to be relevant for the folks in the room, but it's possible. Then there's Form 990 EZ, then Form 990, which is where I think most of the folks in the room are going to fall. Generally, a Form 990 is completed by a CPA. My most recent memory is that it costs somewhere between $1,000 to $2,500 for a CPA to prepare a 990. I'm curious if anybody in the room wants to put in the chat what they're paying to have their 990 completed. If you fail to, all right. 990 is due 5 months and 15 days after the end of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year, and so the fiscal year is how you manage your finances. It's always, so it could be December 31st is for, I'd say, the majority of nonprofits. Some organizations, their fiscal year ends on June 30th because that's when the state's fiscal year ends. And some end on September 30, which is when the federal fiscal year ends. So what you do is you just do the math. So if your fiscal year ends December 31st, your 990 is due on May 15th. It's very easy to apply for an extension of 6 months to your 990. If you don't file, the IRS will fine you, will fine your organization. And so it's an odd situation. You don't have any income to report. Why do I have to file? You have to file because the IRS says you have to file. If you don't file for 3 years, then your tax exempt status will be revoked. So it's a thing. And I think one of the things that's important about a 990 is it tells all 990s are public information and must be, if somebody calls your library and says, can you send me a copy of your 990, you have to comply with that. And it tells a story about your organization. You have your mission statement, you list your sources of revenue. So it's important that it not be just done by a CPA, but also reviewed by the staff, and it's required to be reviewed by the board prior to being submitted. I'm just going to take a minute in the chat. Joy, is there anything that we should stop and talk
there's
about?
some questions about the financial side of submitting the form. So it looks like maybe one library was not in compliance for a while. It had been because they weren't aware of the report. And so now there's a fee. And Tammy's wondering if there's a way to basically, beg for forgiveness. Tammy, if you want to come off mic and just explain that verbally, you could probably do it better than me trying to paraphrase.
I can certainly do that.
Thank you.
So we are a small library. We work with an annual budget of about $28,000 a year. We were unaware of the biannual report requirements for the state of Vermont. It popped up on a grant that we were applying for. So I reached out to the state to see if I could set that up. Found out that our corporation already existed with the state, and they were looking for 14 years worth of $25 a year fees, which is $545, which to us is a lot of money. I didn't know if there's any workaround, if there's anyone I could beg forgiveness to, and it wasn't even mailed. It was never, a notice over these last years was never mailed to the library. It went to a librarian that we haven't had in place for probably 12 plus years. So no one was aware that this was a requirement or that we were not in compliance with it. So I was wondering if anybody could give me a name that I could, and I've tried, so this popped up when we had to activate a Vermont unemployment account, and they were looking for this report. So I immediately went online, tried to set it up. Then, like I said, realized we already had one and completed the information. And when I got to the billing piece of it, the total came to $545 because they were looking for that $25 a year fee.
What a lesson learned. What a story, Tammy. I'm aware of appealing an IRS fine, and my experience, always unsuccessful. Now there may be, which is not, I don't want to say that by definition. Does anybody in the room have experience appealing a fine imposed by the Secretary of State's office?
I have. It was for lobbying fees, not the biennial report, but and I think it is really on a case-by-case basis, but I think reaching out and explaining the situation you're in may be worth a shot, but they really have no formal path that I'm aware of to clearing.
Should I try reaching out directly to the Secretary of State?
I think whoever is in charge of the business division, potentially.
Okay. And I did try to get some information if there was anybody I could contact from the Vermont Department of Employment and Training, and they didn't have they couldn't give me any information on that. So I was looking for someone to contact, but I think you can actually reach out directly to the Secretary of State. I think she has an email address, has an email address on there. I don't know if she actually gets that, but I'm willing to give it a try.
It's always worth a shot. And I think this really does just speak to the importance of making sure that, and obviously out of your hands, but keeping that information up to date so that you're receiving the notices and reminders that you need to keep in compliance.
Thank you.
And this information is easily publicly available. If you go to the Vermont Secretary of State website, there's a corporation lookup, and it'll tell you whether your nonprofit is active or inactive. I don't have a link offhand, but I think it's pretty easy to navigate. I'll note, Tammy, that you have a very generous CPA or accountant on your 990. That person also might have some advice for you about if they know somebody in the office. So, Fletcher Memorial, which is going to be a really sizable library, is paying $1,800 for their 990. Anyone have a nonprofit CPA they'd recommend? Somebody who I've worked with previously is JMM and Associates. And when we take a break, I can put a link to them in the chat. And I'm just going to say it's not a recommendation, but I know they do nonprofit financials. Is there anybody else, or if somebody wants to put in the chat, maybe if there's an accountant that you like who could help with a 990, that would be great.
So Martin, I just want to say a couple things. I did put the link to the Secretary of State site where you can look up your organization. And then also Fletcher Memorial Library is not the same as Fletcher Free. So it's actually a pretty small library. So that's a big fee for them.
That is a big fee. Where is Fletcher Memorial located?
Ludlow.
Okay, all right. Lesson learned. I think that's it for me on the 990. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that's, I think, actually there might be a couple of you in the room who this is applicable to. I was going to say this is a part of an organization life story. If you're an established, incorporated 501c3 organization, you've done this. You've got an EIN, employer identification number. You've got a letter from the IRS indicating you have a tax exempt status. You're registered with the Vermont Department of Taxes and the Vermont Department of Library. And part of why, the next slide, please, Emma. when we do these introduction to nonprofit organizations, we often talk about organizational life cycles. So the screen that we just looked at, the Vermont tax and unemployment insurance accounts and IDs, is at birth, right? That's when your organization was formed, or moved from being a municipal library to being incorporated. So, and when we talk about organizational life cycles, we often talk about there's a growth, and then there's a slowly fading away. On the bottom left screen or icon, it says birth, and then stability, then death. And libraries are pretty unique in this manner, in that I think, much more stable organizations. Your building you have a building that sort of anchors you in place. You're filled with books. You have a history of library directors and circulation staff, maybe. But I know that life also can get complicated for a library. We're moving away. We have internet, obviously. We have computer stations. The DVD section's not being used much anymore. You may be providing more refuge for folks who are experiencing homelessness. You may go through a challenging employment situation where the library director is not achieving what you had hoped. So just to say that your organization, your nonprofit, has a life, and it's worth noting the history of that and where you are and what's called for at this time. If you're a high-flying, experienced, high-performing organization, then you have opportunities that are that you can choose to pursue. If you're an organization that's in transition, then you may be looking at a different set of activities and needing different support and services from your board of directors or board of trustees. So just calling out that your organization has a life that's worth noting and talking about. Next slide, Emma, please. I have a note that we're going to sort of pull this slide up and then not spend much time on it, because my assumption is that most of you have this C3 status. You have sales tax exemption. You are not exempt from room and meals tax, with a few exceptions. One thing I did want to sort of confirm is the exemption from property taxes. Is there anybody in the room who's an incorporated library and is paying property taxes or pilot payment in lieu of taxes? Not seeing anybody come forward or going in the chat. It can be a bear sometimes if you are paying property taxes and you want to move to an exemption. It can create some ill will in town, I'm familiar with. So next slide, please, Emma.
So we just want to do a quick overview of unemployment insurance, since there are some nuances and updates in this area applicable to both 501c3s and municipalities. So effective July 1 of this year, all nonprofits and municipal entities, no matter how many people they employ, if they have employees, that is, must register with the Vermont Department of Labor to be part of the unemployment insurance program. Previously, organizations with 3 or fewer employees did not have to register, and their employees were not eligible for unemployment relief. So following the pandemic, when there was a lot of complications from that, this new law was passed that does require all entities to register with the state and report their employees' wages every quarter, report hiring new employees, and pay unemployment claims if their employees lose their jobs and are eligible for benefits. Very briefly, this is the reporting schedule, just so it's on your radar, quarterly by the following business day, if the date falls on a weekend. And just as a reminder, as this can be an election you make, if you're in one option and want to switch, you can, but nonprofit and municipal entities have the option to be either a taxable or a reimbursable employer for state unemployment insurance. So as a taxable employer, you're essentially assigned an experience rating, and you pay taxes based on that for state taxes. Both nonprofits and municipalities are exempt from federal unemployment taxes. So this is really just speaking to state unemployment taxes. And if you're taxable, then any unemployment claims are paid out of the UI trust fund. Alternatively, nonprofits and municipalities can elect to be reimbursable employers, which means you're not going to pay regular taxes. You're exempt from any quarterly contributions to the state. But then if you do have a claim that's made against you, you have to pay the state back in full for that claim. And so that could be an unexpected, unbudgeted, pretty significant expense. So it's not without risk, but nonprofits do tend to have slightly more stable employment than other sectors. And we've also included some slides. We did a training with the Department of Labor on this to help folks be aware of the new law. So encourage you to check that out. There's a recording of that training as well, linked with the unemployment insurance guide.
We're 2 slides away from going off share and opening up for questions and discussion. I personally find unemployment insurance to be a challenge to get my head around about what the best choice is about how to protect ourselves with unemployment insurance. So we'll get back to that. We'll give chance for questions and discussion shortly. So insurance for nonprofits, property, benefits, liability. We'll be talking a little bit. The next slide is on liability. So property insurance, your building and contents coverage, crime coverage, and workers' comp. And workers' comp is obviously for your employees. You may offer optional benefits for your employees, health, dental, life insurance. And then lastly, liability. Many of these benefits can be bundled under one agent or broker. And I think what I would encourage you, when you have a moment and you have an afternoon, is invite your person into your office and say, how's our policy? How are our policies? Are we adequately covered? Are there savings that can be made? And if you're not able to do that, that is, you're not sure, that the person doesn't willingly come forward and say, yeah, I'm happy to come visit you in your library, then you might think about a different broker. This is in my experience, a very personal relationship, personal professional relationship, that's vital to have, because you will have claims. Yes, you will have claims, and you want to have the right insurances that are in place. When we come off screen, one of the things, a question I have is for those of you who have experienced flooding and what your experience has been with your insurance. Next slide, please, Emma. So types of liability insurance, commercial general liability, you must have this coverage. This is sort of the most basic corporate insurance policy, which is to protect you against liability. That is a slip and fall on your sidewalk, something happens to your building, personal injury. So you need a commercial general liability policy. Directors and officers kind of bugs me, and this is on a personal level. The state of Vermont provides pretty good protections for directors and trustees from litigation. But that said, many board members will only join a board if they are protected by directors and officers liability insurance. And so again, I want to get to the bundling that this would be an add-on to your general liability, and the same would be professional liability, and then you have auto, cyber. Emma, can you speak to cyber? What does cyber cover?
Sorry, gotta find the mute. So cyber covers, if you have a data breach or you're releasing sensitive data. I think I was having a discussion with, I think it was the Libraries Association. They were talking about how the data privacy bill that was in the legislature this last session would impact libraries, and how the records of what books people check out should be protected in private. So it is important to have that cyber coverage and make sure that you're protected should you have a breach of any kind.
So this is to protect, it's a liability, a protection against a liability related to leaked information, a breach of privacy. Got it.
Exactly. And I think it extends beyond that in some situations, but that's probably the most relevant here.
Great. Sexual abuse and molestation. And then lastly, employment practices liability is expensive and in my experience, needed. And again, it would depend on the size of your library and maybe your library culture. Litigation for discrimination by an employee or a prospective employee can be very expensive and untimely. That is, you don't see it coming and can be a significant cost to the nonprofit. So we're going to go off screen. And if any of you are able to go turn your video on, that would be great. So I'm just going to start with, are there questions that you have about the content that we've done this morning? Vicki, I'm going to call on you. Let's say more about the employment law and the employment insurance.
Yeah, just in my experience, and unfortunately I've had a couple situations, it just doesn't take much for somebody to become dissatisfied with the conditions in employment or the manner in which they left, whether they left on their own or were asked to leave by a supervisor. It just doesn't take much to for them to, quote unquote, lawyer up. And some deductibles on those policies may be $10,000, but you can get to $10,000 pretty easily and pretty fast. Yes. Most attorneys take several $1,000s in a retainer fee up front, so it's not going to take long. And usually employment cases, well, in Pennsylvania, employment cases weren't taken on a contingent fee basis. It was usually hourly. So because they can get lawyers' fees back if they're successful, and the court awards them, especially in a federal court. So it adds up pretty quickly. And I've found that small nonprofits, whether it's a library or not, don't have the best employment practices, meaning, you're not really great about having updated job descriptions and an orientation and having a hire letter that really covers all the bases and things like that. So when you get casual about that stuff, because you're small and you just don't think about it, it kind of leaves you open for some risk. So I would definitely have that one.
That's really great advice, and you're right. Some of you may have organizations that operate relatively informally, and your personnel policies are out of date. You don't have a whistleblower policy. You don't have an updated questions you asked during an interview. So you're asking something that indicates the age of the prospective employee. So there are all ways that one can trip up. And I get back to the notion of having a broker who you rely on and feel confident in, who understands all the things that you're involved in as an organization, and for them to advise you on the best suite of policies. Pat, you have a question in the chat. The state does not provide insurance. They do provide some protections for directors by law for directors and trustees, and I'll follow up with Joy with a link to get that information. But so it's not an insurance policy for directors, but it does provide protections. I'm looking at the chat here. Joy, is there anything that you would think we should call out at this point?
Jeanette has her hand up.
Jeanette,
Yeah,
yes,
hi,
please.
hi, everybody. I'm the Assistant State Librarian. I'm also on the board of the Vermont Public Library Foundation and
Oh,
the
great.
treasurer, and had to get board insurance for us. And Common Good actually helped us connect to an insurer. It was a little bit difficult to find insurance because we are a virtual board and don't have a physical location, so that's a little different from all of you. But yeah, Common Good was a good place to start for board insurance.
Who did we recommend, or who did you find through
I
us?
have to see who ended up doing it. Like I said, because we're a virtual board and only meet virtually and don't have a location, it was a little bit more difficult to find a
Right.
broker. But I can see who's insuring VPLF, and I can put that in the chat while you all talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeanette. I'm seeing the question from Tammy about at will. So I know, so generally employees of a nonprofit organization are at will, and that includes the executive director and all other staff, meaning they can be terminated from their position with or without cause. This then raises all sorts of issues related to unemployment, employment insurance coverage. I'm aware that some libraries in Vermont are unionized, which would protect against termination for without cause. Anybody else want to speak to the at-will versus
I just
staff
want to
under
say that
contract?
even in a union shop, that wouldn't cover the management, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Management in any circumstance are at will, and the library director serves at the will of the board of directors of the board of trustees.
So I
What
have a
about-
question about, so I thought that Vermont, except for unions, like everybody was at will. Is that not
That's
right?
true. Yeah,
Okay.
that's correct. Right?
One can have a contract, and
okay.
a board can offer a library director a contract, which may spell out some terms that give the employee some protections. It's unusual. Usually the employment letter says there's nothing that's implied as contractual and you work at will, but there are circumstances where somebody could negotiate a contract.
I believe you also clearly need to state to your team that you are an at-will employer. I can speak from experience as a for-profit business that is an at-will employer. You also do have to, if you're not willing to give a reason, you have to accept the fact that they can and will probably collect unemployment. But I'm not an attorney, but I can tell you that we have been advised by our attorney as a for-profit business to not give a reason for termination, to not open up that venue of being able to create a lawsuit for not for being terminated for a reason. So, and again, you have to accept the fact that they can and will be able to collect unemployment. The Vermont Department of Employment and Training will ask you for a reason. You just need to indicate to them that you're an at-will employer. Sometimes they will push back on that, but you just need to hold steady on that, and the employee or ex-employee will be able to collect unemployment.
It's really great advice, Tammy. And another thing I'll point out about at will is it goes both ways. Somebody can
Yes.
leave without notice. They can, I mean, they're not going to get a recommendation or a reference from the library, but the at will goes both ways. They're under no obligation to stay in employment. Is there anybody who, I'm just curious, anybody who had was impacted by floods either last year or this year who want to speak to an insurance issue? Did you have business coverage? Thankfully, it looks like no impacted libraries are in the room.
Yeah, I'm a trustee at Kellogg Hubbard Library, and
Hi, Jeff.
Kellogg Hubbard Library was badly affected by the
Yeah.
flooding. I don't know the details, but the insurance did pay their full coverage amount.
Is your elevator back in operation?
It's still under construction, but looks like it's closing in on completion in the next few weeks or a month or something like that.
Great. Well, that's good news. Glad you were able to be covered. Emma?
Oh, I was just, Becky, is your hand still raised from before, or did you have a new question?
Sorry, yeah, I was just chiming in on the at will. And that's
Please.
again where it's really important, like on your hire letter, like you should always have a hire letter for people, and it should state in there that you're an at will employer, which you likely are. And then I think you mentioned it, Martin, where you said some folks can be employed with a contract. So, you know, there may be a contract employing usually the director. But the other thing, and then I'll shut up, is make sure your bylaws specifically spell out that the board governs the activities of the library director, and that the library director has the responsibility for supervising staff. So that line of authority becomes pretty clear in terms of, again, risk management. It's really helpful. And a lot of people have, I have found in my long career, a lot of people have misunderstandings about what at will means and what rights they're entitled to, et cetera, and spelling that stuff out from the beginning just is super helpful.
Great, thank you. That's good advice, Vicki. And we'll talking briefly about bylaws a little bit later. Emma, maybe we need to go back to the slides.
All right. Let me get there. All right. Bear with me while the computer catches up. All right. Done that. So we wanted, Joy had asked us to touch on libraries and open meeting law. And I'm going to just start by prefacing that there's, as we found with the structure of libraries, there's a lot of gray areas. So this is really a rule of thumb. And I am waiting to confirm with the Secretary of State that this information is 100% true. So I will confirm that afterwards. But so as we talked about earlier, there's incorporated and municipal libraries being defined by formation, either through incorporation versus a town vote. And so incorporated nonprofit libraries are typically not subject to open meeting law, but there's an asterisk there, and I'll get to that in a minute. Whereas municipal libraries are required to follow open meeting law as they are a government entity. But that said, incorporated libraries often do receive funding from state and local grants that may require them to adopt open meeting laws or other specific practices as a condition of that funding. And so this should not only be adopted in practice, but also in your bylaws. And then finally, for Friends of the Library, as this is an independent 501c3, they are not subject to open meeting law. But generally, we, as do the minimum standards for Vermont public libraries, advocate that open meeting law is the best practice in general. And so providing open notice of meetings, advance notice of meetings, doing all business and taking actions in open meeting unless there's an exemption in the statute that applies, or an executive session, allowing members of the public to attend and participate in meetings, and to take meeting minutes and to make them available to the public. And again, this is a voluntary but encouraged best practice for incorporated nonprofits for the minimum standards by Vermont public libraries. And then we also just wanted to flag another recent change that went into effect this past July. Act 133 first defines advisory versus non-advisory boards, which have slightly different open meeting law requirements. Municipal libraries fall under the category of non-advisory, or also referred to as decision-making bodies. And these new changes include that the meetings must be recorded and posted to a designated electronic location for 30 days, that hybrid access to meetings must be available upon request. And starting this January, non-advisory bodies must hold all regular and special meetings as hybrid meetings. So you're going to need that physical meeting location and a meeting platform. So in the case that you might not have that physical location, it would be important to seek clarity there with the Secretary of State. And then finally, board chairs are going to be required to attend open meeting law trainings annually, which the Secretary of State will have information available this coming winter. And I've linked there to the Secretary of State's website, which has more information. And again, I will follow up if there's any clarification needed from the Secretary of State's office as well. Martin, you're on mute.
Thanks, Emma. The bylaws describe how your organization, your library operates, with the rules of particularly of the board of directors and the board of directors and their oversight of the library director. It very basically need to be consistent with your articles of incorporation, which the articles of incorporation usually are fairly broadly stated. And so it's easy to remain in line with them, particularly related to the mission of the library. You filed, when you applied for tax exempt status, you filed your bylaws with the IRS. That said, bylaws can be modified by the library at their discretion, according to, usually there's a section in the bylaws about how you can amend the bylaws. And if you follow those rules, the board of directors, the board of trustees has the authority to change how it operates, and probably should periodically consider that. Are we operating in a manner that's most effective for the organization? So some of the ways that a board might change is how many seats, how many folks sit on the board of directors, and what's the composition of that board. I know when I was at Kellogg Hubbard, we modified our bylaws to make a seat, designate a seat for the Montpelier City Council, for them to appoint. So evaluating how many folks are on your board, and are there designated seats? What is your fiscal year? You can modify your fiscal year. It's a pain in the neck, but it's always possible to be, again, whatever works best for the organization. Many of us over the years have moved to be making decisions electronically via email, and your bylaws should describe how that's done. Delivered electronically through email with 3 days notice, and a vote submitted to the president of the board in a manner that indicates their vote on the item. That is, your bylaws should I believe your bylaws should allow for that, and have a process defined. Joy.
So we have several libraries that are quite old, and they've had, obviously turnover in staff and trustees, and some of them don't know where their bylaws are. So based on what you just said, if they were filed with the IRS, would that be a place they could go to track them down if they don't have another copy of them?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. The IRS, I suspect, is so sprawling. I think where I would start would be, who is the registered agent for the nonprofit? If it's an attorney, so generally you have an attorney you work with to get tax exempt status. Now, this could be how many years ago, decades ago. But there would be a copy in that attorney or that attorney's office should have a copy. Otherwise, I'm stumped. Anybody in the room have any advice on that? Consult with an attorney, or as somebody, Vicky suggested, past board members or even the town. So I'm slightly stumped on this one. And I would say, ultimately, if you are unable to locate bylaws, then convene the board and pass bylaws. There's a link here, see sample, in this. That's a place to get started. There's a lot that unfortunately, I'd say it's fair to say you cannot just sort of take somebody else's bylaws and pass them. It really requires you to go through section by section and say, is this exactly how we want to act? Another opportunity would be to go to one of your colleagues another private incorporated library and say, can you give us your bylaws as a Word document and start working from there? Emma, anything you
So-
want to add? Or go ahead, please.
So you're saying that if they can't find them, they could just create new ones?
That's what I would do. I mean, I don't see what other option there is. I mean, I would go on the basic assumption that we currently have 8 board members and a quorum is a majority. So 5 people need to vote in favor and just sort of follow common sense. You're worried if somebody is gonna sue the library board for negligence. I can't see where this would expose the library board in a manner that somebody would say this is not done in accordance with state law. Might actually, I say that, I wonder if talking with somebody at the corporations division at the Secretary of State's office would be helpful in this.
Yeah, my thought would be potentially, if you do need to start from scratch, is looking at your articles of incorporation, since there would at least be a starting point and they can't be in conflict. And sometimes they contain more than the minimum. But yeah.
And Emma, there's a question about open meeting law and email voting. I mean, one thing I'll note is a vote by the board via email, there should be minutes of that as a meeting that describes the item that was voted on, when it was sent, and what the vote was, and that those could be posted publicly. But otherwise, Emma, do you have anything to add?
I would have to confirm with open meeting law requirements, but I believe there would have to be a record and it would have to be at an open meeting, assuming it was public knowledge.
Yeah.
But that would be different if you're not subject to open meeting law.
Yes, Joy says, and it should have been warned. Yes, you need to in your bylaws identify for an electronic vote how a vote is warned, and usually it would be by email. You may ask for confirmation that they've received the warning, and then the minutes, and then the noting in the minutes how much time and how people were notified and how much time they had to vote. Let's see, anything else on here? I think that's it. We got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it back to you, Emma.
All right. So just circling back to the maintaining your nonprofit status question we touched on earlier. We did just want to share a little bit of information about the ability of organizations to lobby and advocate. First, defining advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is sort of a much larger bucket of which lobbying is a subset, and there's no limit on how much a 501c3 can lobby. And this can advocate, sorry, there is a cap on lobbying. And this includes everything from telling your story to fundraising to period events and issuing a report. These are all forms of advocacy that elevate your mission and bring attention to your library, but and they're forms of advocacy. Lobbying, on the other hand, involves specifically talking to policymakers about legislation and asking for a specific vote or reflecting a specific view on a specific piece of legislation. It's important to keep in mind that this needs to remain nonpartisan. You cannot endorse candidates. And while there is a limit for 501c3s, it is permitted as long as you're registered with the state and not substantially lobbying, which we'll get into in a minute here. And so there are limits on lobbying. There's 2 different ways that this can be measured. The default is the substantial part test, which is a little bit of a gray area. So if you're just doing a little bit, you're probably fine here. But if you find yourself participating in more lobbying activity, you may want to file a 501H to elect the expenditure test option, which gives you a specific limit on how much lobbying you can do. So it gives you that security. And I will just say that municipalities are also allowed to lobby, although they cannot use public funds to conduct grassroots lobbying. So you can't ask the public to vote a certain way on something. And these are just some additional resources. We're about at the end of the presentation now. So again, we have the Title 11B linked there. We also have the National Council of Nonprofits. So Common Good Vermont is a state nonprofit association. There are organizations like us across the country, and we're all members of the National Council of Nonprofits, and they have lots of great information about operating a nonprofit, advocacy, and just a ton of resources if you have any questions. Also linked some of the state agencies, fundraising compliance, as well as the VCF form, where if you're seeking funding, you can connect with VCF, the Vermont Community Foundation there. And finally, we have the National Council Impact Matters report, which just has some interesting data on the sector, Common Good Vermont's data site, as well as some links to sector newsletters and information. So I'm going to come off screen and we can take some final questions, and we'll follow up afterwards with any remaining questions. And thank you.
This is your chance, everybody, to ask questions that Kevin and I are always saying, well, we don't know this or we can't answer this. So please ask questions.
It's also entirely possible that we don't know, but we will follow up with additional information if we don't have the answer. Stephen.
What happens if you are a municipal library, but your library was never voted upon?
Are you not incorporated then?
I work for two libraries. One is incorporated, one is municipal, and the history of it's kind of ambiguous, to say the least. So I don't know if it was officially town voted or if it was just kind of, it started, there was a town library, it kind of went defunct for a while, then a member of the community gave a large chunk of money to the town to start a library again. So I don't know if they vote, if it was a town vote to make the library, or if it was just a committee that put the library together. But I'm just wondering, if we find out that it wasn't voted upon, do we need to do anything to continue to exist?
That seems like a situation that needs definitely some deeper digging. I wonder if there's any clarity. You've probably already worked with the town to sort of explore this.
Well, the question just came to me today when I was watching, when I joined the webinar, because I didn't realize that had to be a town vote. Our current board that we have has some good board members on it that are, delving deeper into certain things. But some of the previous board members didn't have the, knowledge that they needed to look into things. So it was kind of always like, this is how it's always been. So this is how we're going to continue to do it. Because we're municipal on paper, but we have to raise our own funds. I'm the director there, but the library pays for my payroll, but the town actually cuts the check and we reimburse the town for my payroll. And we have to come up with all of our own operating budget. So
how long has the library been operating, Stephen?
We just celebrated our 25th year in operation.
And you are confident that 25 years ago there was no vote by the.
I'm not confident in that. I'm just wondering, if I find out that there was no vote, what do we do?
Yeah, because I wonder if there was a vote to accept the the donation. I mean, I'm going to step out of I'm going to step into a non-common good Vermont opinion, which is I wouldn't worry about it. I can't.
Okay.
That is, if you that there you're tax exempt. So the issue would be, I believe this came up about whether you are considered tax exempt. You have operated as if you're tax exempt, I assume, or the town has assumed that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it'd be fair to say that you have consent of the municipality for this arrangement. And I'm saying this not as an attorney or as a CPA, but just
Right.
that common sense I think might apply. Joy, am I overstepping, do you think?
Well, I have a couple thoughts, and again, of course, not an attorney, but and Stephen, we've probably talked about this, but I think, I mean, you're fortunate that it's not that old, so there you might be able to dig around and actually find some information. But I think if it wasn't voted on to be created, it's not a municipal library, and that you should that it might be time for you to incorporate now and register. Because I think that's what, according to statute, that's what forms a municipal library, is that vote.
Is it
So it doesn't
Dorset?
really, I mean, it doesn't, whether the town is paying your paycheck or where the money comes from is a separate matter than the actual creation of the organization, I think.
Okay,
Again, not a lawyer.
Yeah, we went through a couple of directors before I started, and I'm actually on my way out of this library. And we're interviewing for new directors, so we're just trying to button some things up before we continue any further. But it wasn't until the previous director that they even started looking to figure out if they were municipal or if they were incorporated themselves. So it was kind of a gray area for a while.
Have you been to that site that I linked to earlier to see if the library is on that secretary? Okay.
That
Are you the Dorset Village? Is it the Dorset
No,
Village?
this is Dorset. We're good there. My director is Erica. She's here in the webinar. We're incorporated there, 501c3. All of that is perfect. It's the Roslyn Keshinkate Library in Rupert that's the one in question. So it's been something I've been trying to figure out now in the 3 years that I've been there, without a whole heck of a lot of luck. And it's been like a concerted effort between most of the board members, just trying to figure out and get everything laid out.
Yeah, and I'm going to withdraw my advice and say that Joy is really the one that's going to provide direction, I think, on what your next steps might be. And I wonder, would it raise flags for the community? Should you go to the select board now and ask them to recognize you as a municipal library?
No, I don't think so. We're gaining more support from, the community. Currently it's a changing community. There's been a lot of new people moving in. It's a less than 700 member community, so it's a very small place. So I don't think we would receive any opposition to doing it. I'm just doing worst case scenario.
Got it. Thank you, Stephen. Anybody else have anything they want to ask or raise at this point, or comments on the content? Okay, well, Joy, I see you've posted this PowerPoint.
I will share the full slides with you, Joy, and you can upload it.
That would be great. All right, thank you. This has been so informative, so thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being so interactive and asking questions. And I'm sort of glad to know it's not just me that finds some gray area. So thank you for thinking through the nuances and helping us figure it out here in library world. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, really encourage folks to complete the evaluation that's been posted. And in particular, if there's any follow-up that you would like to see on additional trainings or questions that you had coming out of this.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.